This is the Biblical Mind Podcast, produced by the Center for Hebraic Thought. Honest 5-star reviews help others find this podcast. Visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org for articles and videos that explore the deep structures of Scripture.
I would think a lot of people never even think about Jewish pilgrimage. Like, it's not even a thought that crosses their mind.
Well, no. So we have a couple of narratives, including just after Jesus' birth, where he's going to. I mean, he's not going. He's being taken to Jerusalem by Mary and Joseph, and then it's bookended with when he's going to get crucified. It's Passover, which is another pilgrimage holiday. And the whole crucifixion narrative for my students takes away, even if they've had a conversation about pilgrimage, it's often missed, right? That he's doing pilgrimage, he's celebrating Passover. Luke tells us that he's eating Passover in the Gospels, and it's overlooked. So I find when people talk about pilgrimage and trying to figure out what pilgrimage was in the first century, they're often going like before the gospel, and then they may tackle Acts, but they're not often tackling the Gospels.
And so even that pilgrimage of Jesus as a child, I mean, the assumption of the gospel writers, I assume, would have been that he's participating in the sacrifice of the lamb, that his household would have sacrificed. Is that correct? Well, we'll stop there. Do you think that's correct that his father is probably sacrificing? And
right,
I'm going off the Samaritan sacrifice that I saw at Mount Gerizim. That
did you see it live?
Yeah, I saw the live sacrifice.
My goodness.
Yeah, and I was writing the book on ritual, and
okay.
And I was there. I was living in Jerusalem, so it's like, hey, I got to go see an animal sacrifice.
I've wanted to see it. I've only seen pictures and videos.
It certainly and I went with a Brazilian friend, and and he called it as soon as we're halfway through it, and he's just like, churrasco, this is barbecue, right? Yeah. This is what churches do.
Yes,
they start with a live animal and they end with a dead animal, and there's some prayers in there, and so it demystified a lot of aspects to animal sacrifice for me, even if it's not, I don't know if we can say that it's directly analogous to what you see in Leviticus, but it's close.
I actually tell my students about the altar in Jerusalem just being a big barbecue.
Yeah.
And they get a kick out of that. And I said, you laugh, but it's also true.
And we know that God likes barbecue because
yes, exactly.
The fatty parts are for him. And and anybody who barbecues knows that's the pleasing aroma comes from the fatty bits.
That's right. You have the L'Oreach Nikoach coming up and smelling it, enjoying it.
Yeah.
The sacrifice. So there's 3 pilgrimage holidays, right?
Right.
So there's the one that we're most familiar with because of the Gospels is the Passover. Then the one we're familiar with because of the book of Acts is Pentecost, or Shavuot. And then there's Sukkot that happens coming up in the fall. Surely during the Passover, the head of the family participating in the sacrificial system and giving the Passover lamb that they then will eat is a big part of that. And a big part of that ritual that they then share. And some people have actually missed it when Jesus sits down with his disciples and he says, how I've longed to eat this Passover with you. Some scholars have even suggested that there is no Passover lamb there, that he's just speaking about the holiday, and they miss the Hebraism that the animal is the same name as the holiday.
Right.
So that when he says, I've long desired to eat this Passover with you, he's speaking in front of a full plate.
Right. So we should stop there and think, because you said Passover is pilgrimage, and I think some people will be confused on this point because they'll say, wait, in Exodus, it seems to be a home-based, the actual original event is in the home.
Right.
It seems to be a home prescription, in the days to come when your sons ask. And then we get to Jerusalem, and all of a sudden everybody's coming down to Jerusalem to do this. And again, for modern Jews today, it's not a Jerusalem-based event. It's back in the home. So what happened there?
So at least in the ancient period, it seems that in Deuteronomy, we already have the 3 holidays that say you should not show before the Lord empty-handed, right? And these are
Right.
the 3 holidays that it describes, although it describes them in slightly different wording. Most scholars put the actual process of pilgrimage, which I guess the easiest definition would be taking a journey to a sacred place to fulfill some sort of ritual, right?
Mm.
And scholars have talked about the various definitions of pilgrimage and how this changes and how this looks in the larger Greco-Roman world. Because outside of Jerusalem, you have people making pilgrimages to their local temples or to the big temples, like the one to Artemis in Ephesus. But for Judaism, apart from the one competitor temple we have in Leontopolis, Egypt for a little while, pilgrimage is always going to the one temple in Jerusalem, at least for Judaism. And it seems most scholars will put usually the resurgence of these aspects of Jewish life right around the Hasmonean period. So this includes the resurgence of spoken Hebrew and other various acts of Jewish religious practice. And then I forget who it was. I think it might be Martin Goodman, who puts Herod's reign and his renovations of the temple,
Right.
Putting in water supplies and aqueducts and all this other stuff that then encouraged even more pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And that's sort of when it reaches its height.
Right. And he tripled the size of the Temple Mount almost.
Exactly.
And,
Yep.
okay. So that brings up lots of issues. And so you're talking about the Hasmoneans. So we're talking about 150 years or so before Jesus. So very recent history when it comes to Christian history. And even what Herod does to Jerusalem, creating that pilgrimage site, there's a mercantilism that comes with pilgrimage,
Absolutely.
right? So there's money being made by somebody here, right? And this is going to be always, I don't know what you call it, I'm trying to avoid the word sinful temptation, but there's always going to be a temptation to turn it into an industry, an industrial complex, right?
Right, exactly.
And maybe some have even seen what Jesus is doing in the temple as rebuking that industrialized complex of temple sacrifice. So, and I'm saying this knowing that everybody who's taken Western Civ, the European history part, is fully aware of the relic and pilgrimage industry of the Roman Catholic Church, right? That becomes problematic at certain points. So, is Jewish pilgrimage in the first century, is it like that? Does it suffer from all those same temptations, or is it doing something completely different?
Well, specifically for Herod, his thing is going to be bringing in the money, right? And he knows, with that, he knows that pilgrimage will try and get the Jewish people on his side. Right.
It's doing lots of political favors for him, both
exactly
as a client king and to the Jews as well. Yeah,
exactly. For the Jewish people, pilgrimage is going to be an aspect of fulfilling the commandments, even though it is largely regarded that these commandments weren't a sort of have to do, right? That there was something that you did if you were it was a show of piety, right?
Right.
We are going because we want to fulfill this aspect of the commandments, and then even Philo speaks about people coming from the diaspora to go to Jerusalem. Some only came once in their entire lives, but they would make their way to Jerusalem for this journey. Now, comparing to sort of later pilgrimage, I guess there are similarities and there are differences. The big difference, of course, I would say, is the attraction to a single city. Whereas all pilgrimage, whether it's Greco-Roman or later Christian, is more varied and sent out to different places or local places, or
it's every city wanted to get their dot on the map of pilgrimage.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah.
Exactly. And you even see that now with the various routes of the Camino that go through Portugal and to eventually get to the traditional burial spot of James. With this, part of it is part of the for the people who go on pilgrimage, part of this is going to be the rhythm of life, right? Because because the Gospel of Luke tells us that Mary and Joseph, that this was their custom. So if they're going on Passover, that means that financially they have to be prepared every year for this period of time, right? Let's say they don't go on other pilgrimage journeys, but Passover is their custom, right? They have to be prepared to make the journey, to stay there for the length of the holiday, and then to make their way back.
And
as
they can't
I tell
send emails preparing the way for that.
No,
right?
exactly.
Yeah.
And I tell my students, there's no vacation pay. It's not like they tap into their supervisor and say, I'm going to take a week off. And I need to go to Jerusalem for pilgrimage. This is something that they have to have in forethought months before it's going to happen.
Including leaving your hamlets, leaving your fields, leaving your all the subsistence living that you've cultivated so carefully.
Exactly. So usually they're probably going in caravans. One of the problems with pilgrimage in the Second Temple period is that our sources, which are really the New Testament, Philo and Josephus, are not the most giving resources in terms of information. We have some information that Shmuel Sofrai, a professor formerly of Hebrew University, is no longer with us, has written a Hebrew book on pilgrimage where he deals with not only the New Testament and the Second Temple sources, but brings in rabbinic sources. Unfortunately, it's never been translated. But you find that rabbinic sources, whatever you may think of them, whether you think they're too late, so we can't use them for the Second Temple period, or you're somewhere in the middle, he uses them to explain, and does so critically in most cases, to shed light on what pilgrimage was in the Second Temple period. For me, I think that this is sort of one of my overarching things, that the Gospels, even if they find later layers upon the narratives, that they give us this source, that they allow us to have a source of pilgrimage in a detail or details that we don't have in other sources.
Yeah. And I mean, one reason these sources, all of them, might not be as detailed as we would want today is because it's maybe for some people such an obvious, it's like telling somebody you went on a road trip this summer out to California, and they're not going to say, and what did you do once your gas got low? Well, we stopped at a gas station. A gas station? What's that? Say more.
Exactly.
It's just assumed that people knew how this went, right?
Well, I guess that happens with sources. You have to try to figure out, what was everyday life like if you don't have that information in a source? And, I think for me, there is some comparison to modern day life, whereas, I have a good friend and a colleague who's done the Camino a number of times. And you have this sort of cottage industry that breaks out because of the Camino. You have places you need to stay, that are affordable for pilgrims, places where they can eat, places where they can stay, places where they can, wash themselves up and rest. And I have to imagine that sensibility has existed for centuries, millennia potentially. So I think the same thing for pilgrimage.
And pilgrimage also has this other aspect to it that you do get this from some of even the gospel parables, is danger on the roads.
Yes.
And the necessity of strategically located stopping points, right? That you have to turn in somewhere for the night. I mean, you even get it actually, a pilgrimage of sorts or a road trip like this in Judges 19, where you have the Levite and his concubine, like, let us turn into the city of Jebus. No, we're going to turn into this other city where my brothers are. You're like, oh, okay, that didn't turn out so well.
This is actually where I think and we don't think about it as a pilgrimage narrative, and it may not be, but the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Right.
He's on the road that we know that goes from Jericho to Jerusalem, which is likely the road that pilgrims are taking if they make their way through what is now Jordan, right? Which would have been Perea at the time.
Right.
And we know from Strabo that when Pompey comes in, the Roman general in 63, that one of the things he wants to do is sort of clear that road of all the brigands and the thieves and the individuals seeking to bring hurt onto people.
Yeah.
So that narrative, even though it doesn't mention pilgrimage, fits very nicely within the larger thinking of what pilgrimage was like.
Yeah, and that makes sense also too, because that Roman road going down to Jericho, it goes through the hills, and there's a million places to hide and to rob people and move on. Yeah.
Yep.
Coming back to Joseph and Mary for a second, thinking about you know they're up in the Galilee, which is almost like your nearest version of diaspora. It's almost diaspora right up there, and so I guess why would a pilgrimage be important for those people? I mean, everybody if you haven't been to Israel, you think of Nazareth as this holy city, this Jewish place, right? And then you go and you realize like, oh, it's really cut off on the top of this hill out in the middle of nowhere, kind of. So why would pilgrimage, what would it mean to them specifically that it wouldn't mean necessarily to someone who lived in the Shefla, the hills around Bethlehem or something?
Yeah. So I think the one thing we have to contend with, and this is, I think, been missed in a number of New Testament commentaries, is that the Galilee is often portrayed as having some stark separation from Jerusalem. And I'm of the opinion, and a number of people are of this opinion as well, that the sources suggest that in the Hasmonean period, the people that go and then inhabit Galilee are actually very well connected to Jerusalem. We see this in archaeology and we see this in ancient sources, right? So that I think that this relationship between, Judea in the south and Galilee in the north creates a desire to be in Jerusalem where the temple is, right? Because as one scholar has said, there's nothing strategic necessarily about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is important because it's a holy city. Right. Compared to other cities that are on major routes, Jerusalem is on this trunk road that sort of goes down the mountains,
end, right?
the Central Hill Country. Right. Exactly.
But literally, it dead ends on a peninsula, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. So it seems to me, and we know this a little bit from the stone that was found in Magdala.
Right. I was thinking of this one.
People have suggested that it has temple imagery on it, and then it has the menorah, which is sort of the temple poster child, I guess.
It's like an icon of the temple, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That there was a desire to be in Jerusalem, to be in the temple, to fulfill these rites, and that Galileans made themselves available to do so.
So, yeah, and we should point out that Nazareth, again, though we think of it as kind of the Jesus city, there was a very particular wave of Jews that moved up to that area, right? So that wasn't a permanently settled Jewish city. Is that correct?
Nazareth, yeah. So it's been discussed by Mordecai Aviam that a lot of our most Jewish cities in the north, our smaller cities that maintain a strong Jewish identity, are going to be east of places like Nazareth, and so in the lower Galilee and areas like that.
Okay, so yeah, so that you have to imagine what would cause people who are, especially Joseph, clearly located, his family's located in Bethlehem. What causes him to move so far away? I mean, one thing is it's easier to farm up there. I mean, it's just there's more water up there, right? So
yeah, that's true.
There's some very natural reasons, and you have access, I guess, to the Sea of Galilee as well. But yeah, so this is a movement back and forth that they seem to be making. Like, do we have a sense of how people thought about what they were doing? Like, is it all about getting to Jerusalem? Thinking about pilgrimage in general, is it all about getting there, or is it the friends we made along the way? Do you have any sense of that?
I think that it's so I think one is, so you're traveling in groups, right? As opposed to, two people walking down 4 or 5 days down a lonely road.
A safety issue. Yeah.
Right. If it's your custom and you're taking the same route, then you're making connections with individuals in smaller cities. And this is one of the things that's been difficult in my trying to think about pilgrimage and routes and try to see what happened on those routes, is that the archaeology of Jordan is not always attuned to, say, Jewish remains in a particular city. But I would imagine as they're making their way through Jordan, or what we see in the Gospel of John is they're making their way through Samaria and they stop at Sychar. It says his disciples go off to find food, which one means that they have some understanding of the city. And if they have some understanding in the city, I can't imagine at that time that you're not making contact with people. So that it's similar to now. Like if you go to Israel any number of times of year, you find that you know certain people, know certain shops. They expect you, they see you. It's sort of a rhythm of life that happens. And I think the same thing's happening in pilgrimage. They're going to various small villages. The people expect them because the holidays are all on the calendar, right? They are not, it's not a shock that they're not a surprise visit. And I'm sure that there are places where pilgrims stay that are getting ready.
Yeah. They're
to
storing
accept
up
a larger influx.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that's going to create even more identity between, say, what we might call Galileans and Judeans. That's going to solidify the Galileans as being in close relationship with the Judeans to the south.
So let's talk about the people who have given up on Jerusalem, and that's the people down south of Jericho there, the Essenes. They essentially, well, at least to some extent, rebuked the temple industrialized complex. So are they the anti-pilgrimage people in this view? They're the other end of the spectrum?
That's a good...
Like, we refuse to go.
Yeah, the anti-pilgrimage people. Well, what's interesting is, so of course, the Dead Sea Scrolls folk, want to get back to Jerusalem, right? They may have, at least the ones in the desert, because Josephus tells us that the Essenes are perhaps living in the cities, not simply in Khirbet Qumran, right? And there is a discussion about Khirbet Qumran, Dead Sea Scroll things reflecting even groups outside of them. But they want to get back to Jerusalem, so they want to make the pilgrimage, let's say, and they want God to reestablish them in the temple, and even create a new temple. But they, as you say, they have turned away from this establishment for various disagreements. Some people think mostly halakhic reasons, mostly legal reasons, that they're not fulfilling the law as they should in Jerusalem, which, by the way, is the same similar critique that Jesus has and other Pharisaic rabbis have.
They heard about Jesus going to the temple. They're like, man, that's what we wanted to do. Beat us to it.
They also think, to some extent, I mean, I'm not sure I would say that Khirbet Qumran is a temple to them, but it's surely a sacred place, right? So they've transferred to some extent the sanctity to where they are. Because even if they're not doing pilgrimage, their association with the temple is still central to their identity. And I think that's part of the larger world of Judaism, that a lot of their identity is going to be connected to the temple, even if there were strands of first century Judaism who were beginning to move more to synagogues.
Yeah. So in Qumran, you see this kind of shift away from the ritual life of Israel having to be at the temple, even if they want it to be there. It's not there anymore. And so the shift towards kind of ultimate piety and preparation for the coming judge, the righteous leader, right? And but do you see a similar? You don't see a similar thing in kind of synagogal Judaism, where or do we see a similar movement in synagogal Judaism? Like, okay, well, we're too far away from there. We're in the diaspora, so let's just focus on piety and purity for the return. Is it a similar movement?
Yeah, I think most of it is practical. I think distance plays a role,
Hmm.
and it's just taking advantage of what they have locally. So first century synagogue is basically the public resource building of the community,
Mm.
right? And sometimes it's going to be used for, let's say, religious practices, reading of the scriptures, studying of the scriptures, and then other times it's going to be used for communal activities, whatever those communal activities are. As a matter of fact, we have a couple of we have at least one first century synagogue that was used for storage during battle,
Mm.
right? And that's the one at Gamala.
Mm.
At least a city that's suggested to be Gamla. There's some disagreement as to whether it's actually Gamla or not, but we'll leave that to the side for
Right,
now.
right.
It still was a first century synagogue that was used for storage when Rome came in and destroyed the Galilee, and destroyed that city.
Storing
So
weapons or storing food and supplies?
everything.
Okay, everything.
Yeah. So I think I think a lot of these things that we sometimes try to put up as, they need to have a very drawn out, lined up, logical reason for doing it, that some of it is just simply practical.
Yeah. And I think it's difficult for, I mean, I guess you could think of it as essentially a good church is going to do this as well. It's going to provide space for teaching people how to read and write, creating resources
Sure.
for people who are in need,
Yeah, absolutely.
teaching scripture, hosting wedding receptions, etc., adjudicating like conflict between
Yeah,
families, etc.
exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think some of the downplaying of the commandment to not show up, before the Lord, let's say in the temple or the tabernacle, empty-handed, becomes not one of those things that is enforced for everybody because of the fact that you're either in the diaspora, or even if if you're in Israel, the land of Israel, it's a long walk. It's an arduous walk,
Yeah.
right? To say the least.
And it's hot.
And it's hot.
Most
exactly.
of the time. Yeah.
Exactly. And one of the main routes is going to have you at least in the Jordan Valley, which is going to be the warmest part. So I think a lot of what develops in first century practice is just simply, how do we make this so that people can still serve the God of Israel, but have certain comforts, if that's a word you can use for the first century.
Right. Comforts, yeah, relative to the life
right,
of an
relative,
agrarian
exactly,
farmer and Roman
exactly.
Empire. One last test case I'd like to throw past you is John the Baptist. Does he create a pilgrimage by, the people are going down to the Jordan to be baptized? Is that kind of the creation of a de novo pilgrimage?
That's a really good question. I've never thought about it like that.
Thank you. Nobody ever says that about me.
I mean, I guess people are, you might say that the way Matthew describes it, and I think Mark as well, where you have all of particular regions coming to him, that there's an aspect of a journey, and the journey is to perform some religious rite with some spiritual meaning. If that is the definition that we're using for pilgrimage, then I would say yes.
Okay, we're getting close there. Yeah.
I think actually that for me, the Gospel of Luke, in its longer retelling, and I presented a paper on this in terms of where John the Baptist is located geographically, and then also what Luke is doing with John the Baptist, that I think Luke actually has sources that go back to the historical John,
right?
And that some of his teachings are maybe not as well. They might fit under a larger meaning of pilgrimage, but he's more so attempting to bring forth ideas of redemption that we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls and other Second Temple sources, which are not as clear in Matthew, Mark, and John. Yeah.
And there's a judgment element there. I mean, so,
sure, absolutely.
He's kind of that Essenian, like there is a judgment coming. He's that Malachian,
yes.
like preparing for the flames. So repent today. I do think it's kind of funny though, if you think about like just the physicality of making, you hear about this man in the wilderness, it's John the Baptist, you make it all the way out there to this prophet of Israel, and you're greeted with this, like, who told you, brood of vipers, to flee the wrath?
Yeah. We were just coming out here to see you, man.
That's the welcome wagon. It's just, like the disciples on the way are just like, just so you know, he's going to be a little crotchety when you get up to the river.
Just so you know, everyone knows him to be a little intense.
Yeah.
But once you get past that intensity, he's a good guy. Just
like that John, he's always at an 11.
Exactly.
Well, Dr. Jeffrey Garcia, thank you so much for your wisdom and just walking us through this very complex world and topography of pilgrimage today.
Thank you for having me. It's been great.
You've been listening to the Biblical Mind podcast, exploring the deep structures of Christian scripture. For more, visit the magazine at thebiblicalmind.org. Subscribe to this podcast at all the usual places so you never miss an episode.